constituencies who agreed to renounce violence and limit competition to bring about shared control and the rents that accrue from them. Under apartheid, the dominant elite was, under apartheid, the polity was organised around the white elite, with blacks excluded, and the rent-violence equation was highly skewed. But if you look at figure 3, we're talking about here white elites with elite representation, and the other extent the violence that we used to block the addition of rents to black people. We have the crisis of the 1970s, forcing white elites to embark on reforms, with differences between white capital wanting, in terms of what they wanted. The urban-based manufacturing sector wanted reforms with fewer restrictions on black labour. So we have the Vihar reforms and so on, some relaxations of black business. Sorry, I've lost my finger. The structure of the limited access order, as was envisaged by the apartheid era reforms, we see as this, with the incorporation of, essentially the incorporation of urban blacks, by the admission to some extent of rents. But these reforms failed to improve growth, they failed to bring stability. There was no adequate redistribution of rents, could substitute for full political representation, and hence the need for the dialogue of big business with government. And eventually the political elite took this up and arranged for a renegotiation of rents. And this is how we see the transition taking place. With the capacities of constituencies of the South African polity prior to the transition, you see the white government with plenty of access to violence and control of rent-generating resources. White business also had plenty of access to violence and the capacity to exploit resources. Trade unions, yes, had some access to violence with worker support and collectivised popular power, some capacity to exploit resources. In the ANC, access to violence was armed struggle and international support, but in exile, of course, it had at that point no access to rent-generating resources. So, it's at this point then actually that business becomes particularly active in playing a central role in facilitating the transition in terms of incorporating the ANC into the new leadership. So we move to figure 6, the limited access order during the transition period. Once in power, the ANC moved quickly to address rent creation for its constituency in terms of reform of public service, recruitment of public service and employment equity, etc. But by this time, most of the big business deals had actually been completed. In other words, big business had already established its political connectivity with key figures within the ANC. And this left a lot of the black business community out of the cold, and they wanted to be let in. And hence we have the Black Management Forum in particular pressing for the BEE Commission, and eventually this leading to the broad-based Black Economic Empowerment Act of 2003. So if I can take you briefly to my conclusion, if you'll forgive me for just actually reading something. Whether we choose to conceive of NWW's approach to as a recycling of modernisation theory with liberal democracy sustained by market capitalism as the end point of societal development, the distinctions they draw between the personalised elite relationships which underlie the LAO and the impersonal relationships which define the open access order clearly mark out how the South Africa of today, they clearly mark out the South Africa of today as the former. Regarding this point, extensive evidence is available regarding how under the ANC, the formerly racially exclusive business elite was deracialised to a considerable degree, the party elite has seized control of the machinery of the state, and inequality has continued to thrive, while the ANC has sought to placate its mass constituency by the significant transfer of state resources in the form of social grants. Crucially, from the perspective of NWW, rent flows have been redirected from white to black elites, while under the ANC, access to rents has been both widened to contending elites, as well as having been directed in the form of grants to its broader constituency. Second, the notion of the LAO confronts how dominant elites maintain control where there is little or no stability in relations between components of the elite, and there is constant pressure from outside for access to elite structures, inclusive of the deployment of violence. However, what is evident is that raw power can be used in some situations, but this needs to be supplemented by political beliefs, values and practices which limit violence if political stability is to be attained and sustained. In NWW's terms, this requires the development of public institutions which provide for the resolution of differences and interests between elites, promoting a viable elite coalition, and thereby averting the resort to violence. Lastly, we go to the last, there we are. If I can interpret this model from the vantage point of NWW, we see that the dominant elite and those whose interests the elite want to advance would be found in the ranks of the advantaged and the contended ranks. We see the advantaged having access to the levels of wealth and power and recorded the legitimacy to utilise those levers as they fit. We would include within the advantaged the topmost ranks of those controlling the party state, alongside the established business elite as constituting this particular category. The contenders are people and organisations such as black business groups and trade unions, which deploy their access to political influence from the inside or outside the ruling party, and readiness to resort to violence to demand greater access to rents. Dependents constitute those who are perceived as being of utility to the elite, but not to the extent that the policy need advance their interests to any great extent. These would be groups that play a role in the continued hegemony of the elite, but who lack the power to leverage significant influence over elite decision-making processes. Today, this grouping is comprised of the mass of the ANC's historic constituency, whose political compliance is secured through the allocation of pensions and grants. Outsiders are those who are perceived by elite policymakers as neither a threat nor possessing the power to exert influence. And we see the overwhelming bulk of this grouping being located in the rural areas in the former Bantustans, where they're subjected to the state-backed coercive rule of the coercive authorities. Lastly, and this is the very last point, the value to be drawn from the challenge made by NWW to the notion of rents. I think it goes back to something that Carl was saying at the beginning this morning. We need to rethink our attitude to how we think of corruption, whether it is always unproductive. Although maybe our ethics rebel against that, but we need to look at the notion of rents and question whether rents are always necessarily unproductive with no broad social benefit. Broadly speaking, one could argue, and it has been argued, that the whole notion of the transfer of rents, the wider incorporation of the elites during the 1990s, prevented a whole lot of violence in South Africa. I think that is something we still need to bear in mind and give some
Thank you for the invitation to discuss the paper. I must say I enjoyed the paper and could not find anything with which to disagree fundamentally. As you know, I'm not here to rehash the paper, but simply to say a few things. I have 5 specific things to say. Perhaps my introductory remarks should be that I'm not sure if it adds any value, Roger, to your paper to decry the elitist nature of BEE. I don't think BEE was ever intended to be a radical redistributive project. It was always going to be elitist and beneficiaries were always going to be few. It was part of an accumulative strategy. Perhaps, unless of course one believes the rhetoric of typical BEE that it's meant to benefit everyone else, which as you also show in your paper hasn't quite materialized. Perhaps most part of our paper or your paper should be focused towards unmasking the falsehoods contained and the failed promises contained in the BEE rhetoric. Because after all, I mean, triple BEE is mainly a rhetoric that was aimed at undercutting critique that was leveled against BEE. The argument that BEE was too elitist and therefore in response to that, they came up with triple BEE as if that's going to be any different to the original BEE. Anyway, my second point, perhaps, flowing from that, is that I quite agree that BEE was essentially a legitimizing strategy to co-opt blacks into business, to give it a sense of legitimacy and de-rationalize it. And this is a very useful framework because it shows the ways in which capital has always worked to protect itself, to give itself legitimacy. It would have been nice, though, to see, assuming that this is indeed the nature of capital, especially in South Africa, it would have been nice to see how English capital perhaps would have done the same thing, especially following 1948 when Afrikaners took power. And the threats that might have been the probably fear would accrue from Afrikaners taking power, they might be excluded. Were there any attempts to co-opt parts of Afrikaner capital into established businesses so as to buy favor with the new Afrikaner elite? I don't think I have come across that, but I would assume if we agree that capital has always worked through co-option, it is perhaps safe to assume that English capital would have done the same thing, to co-opt emerging Afrikaner capital as a way of protecting its interest and ensuring that it becomes part of the new establishment. Perhaps that historical mention might add more value to the paper. The third point for me is then what I perceive to be a somewhat uncomfortable insinuation that black business was entirely or strictly co-opted into white business, especially the aspirant business section of the ANC, because that presupposes that black business or the bourgeois element of the ANC, petty bourgeois, was entirely passive. It was co-opted as if they were duped into conferring legitimacy to the process. My sense is that they were willing partners, because as we know, the ANC has always contained business elements within. To argue that the ANC was co-opted, or certain elements were co-opted, is to give what I think is a very misleading perception that the ANC was necessarily against capital. This whole idea that the ANC was leftist, which I don't know where exactly it comes from, because the ANC has never really been leftist. The ANC has always been contested by the various elements that makes it up. So the point really for me is that is that this bourgeois segment of the ANC, which Joe Slovo warned against in 1985 in his paper, that this middle class business interests in the ANC would to some degree usurp the ANC for its own business interests. So they needed to be careful. They needed to reinforce the leftist element in the ANC. So corruption therefore worked both ways. It was reciprocal, blacks using political control to leverage capital from business. So they were both equal beneficiaries, perhaps not equal, but beneficiaries nonetheless. And last point with the minute that I'm left with is really something perhaps you might worth looking at rather deeply, which is that the inactivity or the silence around black economic empowerment, especially in the private sector, in the last 5 years, for me it speaks to lack of cohesion within the black business sector, especially after 2007. If you look at their mobilization power pre-2007 and post-2007, it's quite different. I think under Thabo Mbeki was able to organize the black business class quite effectively and gave it a very effective voice and was himself a very strong proponent of black business. And it gained momentum to some degree. But the change in political authority within the ANC in 2007 disrupted that cohesion and lessened the momentum that had picked up pre-2007. What you have emerging post-2007 is a very disjointed group of aspirant black business that do not really have a center, because JZ is very happy doing other things, not actually pushing, and partly because the BE project was somewhat legitimized by the Polokwane Brigade, who shouted it down as a bourgeois project. And that lack of momentum, that lack of an advocate, especially from government, might have led the private sector to relax a little bit. Whereas under Mbeki, there was always a lot of clamor for BE. So as a unit, as a cohesive force, black business has somewhat become weak post-2007 compared to pre-2007. And for me, it really explains the silence. And perhaps my very last point is that as a result, black accumulation project has shifted away from the private sector and has become concentrated within the state. The state has become the one area of accumulation. That is why you have a lot more contest over who becomes DG, who becomes the minister, because that's the only path open to a black accumulation project. Thank you.
Mcebisi, Ndletyana from the Minister. We're going to open up to the floor first, and then for 3 questions, and then I'll give respond to those as well as your questions. Any questions? 1, 2, 3. Come here.
Time it will be a question rather than assisting or making comments. My name is Ndletyana. I'm the community development worker in the city of Joburg, employed by the Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs. There seems to be complaints that are not clear exactly at the end what needs to be done. There's no conclusion that gives a direction what needs to be done. And that is the question, because the document of Joe Slovo have been mentioned. And that document at the very same time describes exactly what needs to be done.
I think that if you look at BE as one of those mechanisms to pacify and reallocate resources between incumbent and inspiring elites, whether we look at it from an NWW perspective or from a political settlement perspective. I think it's, I mean, as you very clearly explained in the paper, it's not been entirely successful neither in terms of efficiently suppressing violence, and we see this increasingly, and ties in with what you were just saying about the fact that increasingly competition for access to resources is located within the state, nor in terms of turning this mechanism of pacification and reallocation into a more productive mechanism or developmental tool. And I'd like to know if you could comment a bit perhaps on the reasons